Some might wonder why any gospel preacher would spend time researching a lesson discussing so-called animal rights today. There are actually several reasons why this subject is important, and several of those reasons will be part of our discussion this morning. It is a well-known fact that animal rights people are just as active, if not more so, in our current day than they ever have been in the past, especially since they have an unbridled mouthpiece with that of social media with which to advance their cause today. Most of us have heard of the antics of the animal rights activist groups called PETA, which stands for the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. These people have been known to go to great extents, even to the point of breaking laws, in order to fight something that they themselves say is unlawful, which is the mistreatment of animals. Since when has such a hypocritical attitude as this ever really warranted any serious consideration in the minds of rational thinking people? We often see people today break the law in order to try to advance their cause of something they say is a crime. They're out here fighting against something that's a crime, and they're doing that by committing crime themselves. And that's always seemed very strange to me that people would do this. How could one ever take seriously those who decry crimes against animal life while they themselves commit crime in their so-called defense of their rights? That would be like a preacher standing before a crowd of people preaching against the sin of drunkenness while he himself was standing there intoxicated while he was doing so. It would just be pure hypocrisy. However, before we get much further into this study, I do not want anyone here to think for a moment that I do not care about animals. I was raised to have a great appreciation for all animal life, and I think much more so than many country children are generally raised. I think all country children have a great appreciation for animal life, although some grow to become the type of person to kill animals for the sake of having a trophy rather than that of feeding their family. That is why I have much more respect for people who hunt for food rather than those who hunt for trophies. I'm one person who does not agree with the idea of hunting being merely a sport. If we have no more value for life in general than to simply kill for the sport of it, we are all in need of a change in our way of thinking, I believe. And I think that God's book will back me up on that statement. As Brother Wayne Jackson pointed out in the article that I have, there are passages which reflect the fact that God does have a concern for His lower creatures. Every animal creature was covered in the post-flood covenant that God made with Noah, according to Genesis chapter 9, verse 10. And this is something many of us may have never noticed before. Starting at verse 9, Genesis 9, verses 9 and 10 says this: "And as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you." But it doesn't stop there. Notice what verse 10 says. "And with every creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth." This, of course, was God speaking to Noah and his family. Brother Jackson also goes on to point out that the Israelites were not to muzzle the ox who labored in treading out the grain, according to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. And then also we know that beasts of burden were granted rest even on the Sabbath day, according to Exodus chapter 20 and verse 10. Probably reminds us of the familiar words of Jesus Christ as recorded in Matthew chapter 6, verse 26. that says, "Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they?" But Job 38 verse 41 also reminds us of this divine care which God has for the animal life. That verse says, "Who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food?" However, though we see from these verses that God clearly cares for animal life, I think it is probably due to its importance to that of human life that this care is as great as it really is. After all, God is the creator of both animal life and human life, and these are clearly not the same, though some think that it is. Some think that humans are actually animals. And that, of course, is not true. The fact that this is not true gives God, of course, the only rights to be given over the say to who should be in dominion over the other. That word dominion is one that we read about in Genesis 1 verse 28, shortly after the creation of both man and beast. And there we read about man, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." That should settle the matter for most, that man has dominion over animal life. But sadly, it doesn't in the minds of many people. The word dominion comes from the Hebrew word pronounced radah, and is defined by Strong's Hebrew and Greek dictionary as meaning to tread down. That is, to subjugate, specifically to crumble off or to prevail against, to reign, to bear, to make, to rule over something. And so man is, animal life is to be in subjugation to man. Man is supposed to prevail against or reign over animal life. Of course, there is a difference in ruling over something and thinking that one has the right to mistreat or harm that same thing with which he has been given the right to rule over. Many people think that since they can rule over animal life, that means they can treat it just in any way that they want to. And you know, a lot of women hunters might think the same thing whenever they go out to shoot animals for sport. But you know, I would say to a person like that, if they think that ruling over something means you can mistreat it, they need to turn over to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16 and says, where it says there concerning man's ruling over women. To the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And so if mankind thinks he can rule over and mistreat animals because he has dominion over them, just remember, our women hunters should remember that man is supposed to have rule or dominion over the wife as well. And so we need to think about things like that before we come to those kind of conclusions. Of course, this phrase here, "rule over you," does not come from the same Hebrew word in Genesis 3:16 as the one we read earlier in Genesis 1:28, but it still means to have dominion over, just not to the point of having rigorous dominion over like one might have to treat an animal while working. Like many other rights-related issues, we might want to discuss that some have misplaced priorities when it comes to the so-called rights of animals. We've already mentioned that fact concerning our friends of the PETA persuasion, but it was not too long ago that I saw a Facebook post by a good Christian lady praising PETA, and this organization is simply not worthy of our praise. Because, as I said, they break the law in order to try to protect the rights of animals. If time allowed, we could spend this Sunday as well as several other Sundays discussing the many laws that they've broken by these supposedly caring people. However, we've already pointed out that they are hypocrites when it comes to their care for animals, when they're out there breaking laws that not only hurt human beings, but actually elevate their care for animals over that of human beings. James chapter 1 and verse 8 speaks about this kind of people. James calls these kind of people double-minded. And he says in James 1:8, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Double-minded means a man who has two opinions, or a vacillating in opinion or purpose. Thanks to efforts of such people who do not recognize God's law of human dominance over animal life, we now live in a day, and have lived in a day for some time now, in which animals do in fact have more rights protecting them than humans do. We've often heard of the exorbitant fines and imprisonment that is levied toward those who would harm an unborn eagle while still in the egg. But on the other hand, how the unborn infant in the mother's womb can be murdered at the will of the mother without any fear of fine or imprisonment. And in most cases today, even encouraged to murder that child. Almost as bad as this is the attitude that even many Christians seem to have. And that is the attitude that they care more for animals than they do for human life. For those who are the least familiar with social media today, it's not uncommon to see many of our brothers and sisters in Christ making posts about the mistreatment of animals and pets, and then encouraging others to follow their lead in making exorbitant donations to numerous places that care for the rights of animals, but never mentioning the needs of others like orphans and widows we discussed a couple of weeks ago. I even saw a post just recently about how Christians should be very concerned about the worldly organizations that they donate to, like the Lions Club or the St. Jude's and even the Salvation Army. I quickly replied on this brother's post and informed him that no faithful Christian should be supporting the Salvation Army, since they are in fact a religious denomination that is teaching false doctrine. If we were to support them, of course we would be promoting false doctrine in order for us to go out here and just have more people to try to teach the truth. And that just simply does not make sense to do that. And I also told him that we should be very cautious even about supporting organizations like St. Jude's, simply because many believe them to be affiliated with the Catholic Church, though they really are not. But the name itself lends one to believe that they're affiliated with the Catholic Church. Danny Thomas is actually the one who founded St. Jude's, and Danny Thomas was himself a Catholic, and that's why it is named the way it did, but a lot of people do not know this. And so when a Christian says they're supporting St. Jude's, a lot of people think they're supporting false doctrine by supporting the Catholic Church. We do need to be very careful in who we donate to and support. But one thing we need to be very careful about is supporting organizations like this of a worldly nature, especially when we have faithful brethren preaching in difficult places who cannot support their own work through local efforts. Why not give as we should and support these benevolent means through the Lord's treasury, and let Christ get the glory instead of a human being getting the glory for helping other people? Regardless of what some people teach, the Lord's church is its own benevolent institution. We have an obligation to help certain people in their benevolent needs. In addition to this, has the Lord's people forgotten about what Jesus said regarding those we consider even as our own enemies? Notice what Jesus taught in Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 35. He says there, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you. And from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For He is kind to the unthankful and evil. And yet, how many of us ever think about donating to our needy enemies in this life? And yet, even those in the animal world who have been sworn enemies in the eyes of many humans, like dogs and cats, have been known to care for the young of their counterparts as puppies or kittens when something has happened to those that gave birth to them. Several of us may have seen such videos of a mama dog raising kittens. And these animals are supposed to be enemies with one another. Several of us have probably seen a mama cat raising a puppy or a mama dog raising a kitten. And, that kind of behavior is not necessarily normal, but it shows that even when enemies are in need, that they can be cared for by their enemies. A biblical subject that is rarely mentioned in sermons today is, and even sermons of the past, I think, is a sin known as bestiality. And it's pronounced really bestiality, but most people pronounce it bestiality in order for people to readily understand what the sin is talking about. Of course, this sin is talking about having sexual contact with animals. And many people who have witnessed other animals taking care of other animals, like dogs taking care of kittens and cats taking care of puppies, and the compassion that animal life seemed to have for the needy, has often used those kind of things to promote how much more caring animals are than a lot of humans are. And of course, this has caused a lot of people to misplace their priorities in life, and they choose rather to have more respect for animals than they do for humans. And that's exactly the mindset that would protect an eagle, an unborn eagle in an egg, and not protect a human in the womb of a mother. But this kind of mindset also leads others to commit sin because their way of thinking is completely warped in that sense. They go on even to act like animals in many cases. The Bible tells us that the sin of bestiality is, in fact, a sin that is very terrible and is also talked about in connection with the sin of homosexuality in Leviticus chapter 18 and also Leviticus chapter 20. In those verses, this is what we read starting at verse 22 of Leviticus 18. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Nor shall you mate with any animal to defile yourself with it. Nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is perversion. Leviticus 20, starting at verse 13, says this: If a man lies with a male as he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death, their blood shall be upon them. If a man marries a woman and her mother, it is wickedness. They shall be burned with fire, both he and they, that they may be no wickedness among you. If a man mates with an animal, he shall surely be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. If a woman approaches any animal and mates with it, you shall kill the woman and the animal. They shall surely be put to death, their blood is upon them. While many who support the so-called homosexual lifestyle would not readily support sexual contact with animals, or at least we think many of them wouldn't, but that's not necessarily true. Because a lot of people are not familiar with just how degrading and sinful homosexuality really is. In fact, thanks to the internet and different things that we can use as research tool today, many of us are familiar with some words that a lot of people are not familiar with who do not use these resources. How many of us have heard of a practice or a word called furries? Have you ever heard of a furry? Well, the practice of furries is to dress up as animals, in costumes as animals. And this is a big attraction to those who are gay, specifically those who are gay males around their 20s. They actually have meetings that they go to and go to different types of events that are put on to try to advance the mindset of these people. It falls back in that its history goes into certain cartoons that these people used to watch on television, like Sonic the Hedgehog. People are wanting to dress up like these animals and act like animals, and so that's exactly what a lot of people are starting to do. And most of these people who do this are homosexual males. And part of this, part of the activities that they take part in during their conventions, these furry conventions that they have, is sexual contact. And this sexual contact with those of the same sex also has a name called yiffing. And yiffing is actually the sound that foxes make whenever they mate with one another. And so they've adapted their perverted sexual lifestyle. The homosexuals who take part in these furry events actually call their sexual contact with one another yiffing, because that's the sound that foxes make. And so the practice referred to earlier as bestiality in the Old Testament times is not as uncommon today as one might think that it is. And that is really all I really care to say about the subject in general right now. I could go into a lot greater detail in that, and I don't think that it's really appropriate to do that. But for those of us who have access to the internet and want to know more about this, be very careful in your searches, because it will lead you to some places, into some things you probably would not want to see, very innocently too, I might add. But you know, this just really goes to prove what I've said for a long time. When you get involved in something as sinful as homosexuality and the LGBTQ movement in general, I've said for years now, it is just a matter of time before bestiality comes back into play again, and we see that it's doing that. And also, we're going to see, I believe, that the rise in pedophilia, or sex with children, is going to be something soon to follow. And we also see evidence of that. And that is not a prophecy, my friends. That is simply the worldly past repeating itself. In closing, I would like to address one last aspect concerning animals that, again, I believe many Christians may have a misunderstanding about, and that is the eternal destiny of all animal life. It is not uncommon to hear those who have misplaced values concerning animal life and rights to also think that their beloved pets will somehow be in heaven with them in the eternal realm. There are several reasons why some think this is so, and one such reason might be that of a movie that was created some time back by Walt Disney that is named All Dogs Go to Heaven. Doubtless there are many people who become so attached to their animal friends that they not only treat them better than many human beings and family members, but they also go as far to consider them much closer than the same because of their loyalty and friendship. However, many people fail to realize that any animal's loyalty is generally proportionate to how their owner has treated them. If you treat a dog bad, of course you're not going to get loyalty from it. If you treat a dog good, of course the dog is going to learn through that behavior to be loyal to you. And so this type of loyalty is not the same type of loyalty that human beings have or should have. Animals are simply reciprocating what they've been taught to do, and that which generally results in some kind of affection or treat for doing the same thing. And yet many people think animals have the ability to reason, just like human beings reason, and often better, if you were to ask certain people. And believe it or not, some Christians do actually believe that their animal friends will be in them in the heavenly realm because of their loyalty and their friendship to them come eternity. The first time I heard of this line of reasoning, it actually came from a preacher's wife, believe it or not, who had a pet which she loved dearly and just simply could not stand the thought of being separated from. I believe all of us have probably experienced that feeling toward an animal at least once in our lives. I know I have, but if we were honest with ourselves, even then, we would realize that there was only a certain degree of love that moved us to care for these animals, and that degree of love only went so far concerning our willingness to go in order to care for their earthly welfare. When our dog Koda was hit by a car, even then, I had serious back issues, but I was willing to lift his broken body from the roadside into the back of my truck and speed him to the local vet, who happened to be closed because it was the weekend, but I did all I could at that time for his care and concern. But I must be honest in saying that when it came time to dispose of his body, his physical remains after his death, I was not willing to invest the time and great expense of an elaborate funeral for him. Why? Because he's an animal. He's not a human. Did I care for him? Yes, I cared for him. But would I continue throughout the years to grieve for a poor animal like some do when they lose a blessed child in the prime of life? What right-thinking person would dare say that they grieve over an animal like they would a child? But you know, I hit a nerve with this preacher's wife who, I might as well say, had not experienced childbirth at that time, so I believe she wasn't really thinking from the same perspective that I was thinking about when I shared with her a scripture from the Bible concerning where animals spend their eternal destiny. I asked her to turn over in her Bible and read with me Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 17 through 22. And this is what those verses say. Starting at verse 17, it says, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the Son of Man also happens to animals. One thing befalls them all. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all return to the dust. Talking about the body, not the spiritual part, but the body. But then he talks about the spirit. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth? So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Do these verses of divine inspiration sound like animals will be in the spiritual realm of heaven with the saved of all ages? Of course it doesn't. Verse 21 clearly says that the spirit of men goes upwards, but the spirit of the animal goes down to the earth. Yes, both were made from the dust, and all return to dust, Ecclesiastes 3 verse 20. And yes, verse 19 says that they all have one breath, which means that God gave each their life force, I believe. And Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7 says that the life force returns to God who gave it. However, it should be plain to see that both do not go to an eternal place of heavenly rest, because such a place as this is being prepared for faithful people, not faithful companions that are our pets. In John chapter 14 and verse 2, Jesus was talking to people when he said, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." Yes, friends, heaven is a prepared place for prepared people, and animals do not go there. And sadly, many people will not be found there either. Because Jesus also tells us in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13, "Enter in by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it." The denominational churches in our area would have you all to believe that there are numerous roads to heaven, each being so wide that all who just believe in Jesus as God's Son will be there. But again, Jesus said that way is narrow. And Jesus also said that there's more to getting down that narrow, through that narrow gate, than just simply believing in Jesus. Jesus said in Mark 16:16, "He who believes and is baptized will be saved." Who will you believe? Will you believe the denominational world who tells you that there's no significance to baptism? Or will you believe Jesus who says it is completely part of our obedience to the gospel plan of salvation? I know who I will believe. It will be Jesus Christ. To be prepared for heaven, we must believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. We must confess that faith in Him before witnesses, repent of our past sins, and be baptized for the forgiveness of our past sins. This is how we are a prepared people for heaven. And we need to spend our time here on this earth being concerned about the souls of men. It's all right to have pets and to understand that some people mistreat pets and animals, and we don't need to be that kind of people, because as we see, God is not that type of God. He has care for animals. We should have care for animals, but we should not have misplaced care for animals. We should have our priorities in the right order and understand that animals have their purpose in this life, and that human beings have dominion over the animals, and that we should be taking care of the needs of human beings more so than that of animals. Of course, we need to take care of the animals that have been entrusted to us. But when it comes to prioritizing these things, we need to understand that man is more important, because man has an eternal soul that will spend eternity in either hell or heaven. And of course, this should make the decision about who has the more rights in this life, be it animal or human. This should clear up that question altogether. Hopefully it does in the minds of those that are here today, and hopefully we will be able to explain this to others as we have opportunity to. And hopefully we will be able to get back to centering our minds upon the importance of spreading the gospel and helping people who are needy, even here in our own country, to share the gospel in difficult places here in our own country and in other places, instead of helping out worldly organizations to help people. We seem to be more concerned, or a lot of people seem to be more concerned about the physical well-being of people, the here and now, than what they are the eternal destiny of people. And so we readily give money to such worldly organizations as I've mentioned this morning. And that simply should not be the case. If we have extra money to do things like that with from time to time, some of these organizations do good things. But as I said, we need to be more concerned about the spiritual welfare of men and getting the gospel to the lost and giving God the glory for the things we're able to accomplish through our monetary resources. Hopefully, lessons like this will be able to help us center our minds upon things like that, and also make us aware of some of the terrible things that are going on in the world because of so-called animal rights. If you have a need to respond to the gospel this morning, we pray that you would. Whatever your needs are, please make those needs known as we sing the invitation song.